The valley remembered that February for a long time, not because of the cold, though the cold was the worst in 11 years, not because of the losses, though there were plenty. It remembered that February because of the smoke. It came from the ground. On the seventh morning of the worst stretch, when the temperature had not risen above 0 degrees Fahrenheit for 6 consecutive nights, a hired hand named Comdary was walking the lower fence line of the Bryce property when he saw it. A thin column of gray rising from the north slope of the Voss land, just below the tree line where snow had piled 3 feet deep against the hillside. No chimney, no structure above the snow line, just smoke, slow and steady, as if the earth itself had decided to keep warm. He told Harlan Bryce about it that afternoon. Bryce said nothing for a moment. Then he said he would go have a look. What he found there, what the small group of men who followed him found, was not a ruin, not a fire, not an accident. It was a door, narrow, low, framed in rough timber, almost invisible beneath the overhang of packed snow. And from the gap at its base came warmth, not the violent warmth of a stove burning too hot, the quiet, steady warmth of a place that had been holding heat for a very long time. Bryce knocked. He was not the kind of man who knocked on doors he did not own, but something about the smoke from the ground made him uncertain of the usual rules. The door opened. Margaret Voss stood in the frame, a cup of coffee in her hand, her daughter Ingrid visible behind her sitting at a small wooden table with a book open on her lap. The men outside were standing in cold that made their eyes water. Inside, a candle on the table was burning without flickering. Bryce looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at Bryce. She did not invite him in. She asked if there was something he needed. He said he had come to check on her. She said she was fine. He looked past her at the stone walls, the packed earthen floor, the low ceiling disappearing into darkness, the single ventilation pipe running up and through the hillside, and he could not find the words for what he was seeing. He left. The other men left. The smoke kept rising. And for the rest of that winter, no one from the Bryce property came back. But others did. Before March, they always did. This is a story of how Margaret Voss built the warmest room in the valley out of thing everyone else was trying to survive. If this kind of frontier wisdom matters to you, stay with this story until the end. People like Margaret built things that were never written down. The least we can do is remember them. Margaret had come from the coast of Norway when she was 19 years old. She had not come because she wanted to. She had come because her father had arranged it, and because the man she was to marry, a timber worker named Einar Voss, had already paid the passage. She had married him in a church outside of Duluth 6 weeks after landing, in a dress borrowed from a woman she had met on the ship and would never see again. That was 22 years before the winter of the smoke. Einar had been a good man, careful with money, patient with animals, slow to anger. He had built the main cabin with his own hands in the first year, and he had added to it each spring, so that by the time they'd been on land for a decade, it was a respectable structure, well chinked, with a stone fireplace that drew cleanly and a root cellar dug into the slope behind the house. They had lost 2 children before Ingrid. They had learned not to talk about that too much. Einar died in October, not dramatically. He sat down in the yard after splitting wood and did not get up again. The doctor said it was his heart. Margaret did not have the money to bury him in the churchyard, so she buried him on the east side of the property, where it always said the morning light came through the birch trees in a way that made him think the world was still worth the effort. She was 41 years old. Ingrid was 7. The wood Einar had split before he died amounted to roughly 2.5 cords. Margaret calculated that a winter like the previous one would require closer to 4. She also knew that Ingrid had developed a cough in September that the cold made worse. The doctor in town had used the word chronic in a way that did not sound temporary. He said the child needed to be kept warm at night. He said this without explaining how a widow on a failing homestead was supposed to arrange it. Harlan Bryce came by in late October. He was not a cruel man in any obvious way. He was a practical man, and practical men in that valley tended to expand when their neighbors contracted. He offered Margaret a price of the land that was fair by the standard of what it had produced, which was not much. It was not fair by the standard of what the land was worth or what she had put into it. She told him she would think about it. She did think about it. For 3 days she thought about almost nothing else, walking property lines in the mornings before Ingrid woke up, calculating firewood against weeks, food stores against months, her own physical capacity against the kind of winter that valley was known for. On the 4th day, she stopped thinking about selling and started thinking about the hillside. Her father had built one in Norway. That was where it began. Not a root cellar exactly, though it served some of the same purposes. Something older. Something her father had learned from his own father, who had learned it from people living further north than most Norwegians thought practical. A room built into a hillside below grade, covered by earth and eventually by snow, designed not to generate heat, but to hold it, to keep the cold out rather than fight it from inside. The principle, as her father had explained it to a younger Margaret while they stood in his version of it on a January night with a lantern between them, was almost insultingly simple. The ground a few feet down did not freeze, not in the deep way that the surface did. The earth itself held a temperature, somewhere between 30 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit, even in the hardest winters, and if you put yourself below that surface and sealed the gaps well enough, the cold above you became almost irrelevant. Add a small heat source, 2 bodies, a good door, and a ventilation pipe sized correctly, and the room would reach 50 degrees and hold it through the night with almost no fuel. Her father had called it a living room, not in the modern sense, but in the literal one. A room where living things did not freeze. Margaret had not thought about it in years. She thought about it now. She walked the north slope of her property, the one that caught the most snowfall and lost the least sun, and she found the place where the hill curved inward slightly, creating a natural pocket. The ground there was already shielded, the snow piled against it every winter as if by habit. She dug down with a stake until she hit the layer where the soil changed consistency, where it was cold but not frozen, and she stood for a long time looking at the hillside. She went back to the cabin and told Ingrid she was going to build something. Ingrid asked what. Margaret said she was not entirely sure yet, but that it would be warm. She started digging the next morning. By afternoon, a neighbor named Gus Halverson had ridden past and stopped his horse at the fence line to ask what she was doing. She told him. He listened. Then he told her, with the careful tone of a man trying not to be unkind, that digging into a hillside in November in that part of the valley was a good way to end up buried when the snowmelt came in spring. He said the water table would find her before March. Margaret thanked him for his concern. She kept digging. That evening, Harlan Bryce sent a message through Combe Dairy. The message said the offer for the land was still open. The message also said, though more gently, that people in the valley were starting to talk. Margaret did not send a message back. She sharpened her spade and went to bed early. The frame went in first. She used timber from the old storage shed on the north end of the property, the one that had been listing since Einar's 3rd year, and that she had never been able to convince him to tear down properly. She pulled it apart board by board over 4 days, salvaging what was sound. There was more usable lumber than she expected. Einar had always bought better wood than they strictly needed. It was one of his few extravagances. The hole she had dug was roughly 12 feet deep into the hillside, 8 feet wide, and 7 feet tall at the center. She had measured it against her own arm span, against Ingrid's height, against the minimum she needed to stand upright. The entrance would face slightly east, away from the prevailing winter wind. She had watched where the wind came from for 11 years, and she was certain of this. She framed the walls with the salvaged timber, leaving gaps at regular intervals that she would fill later. The roof was the hardest part. She built it from heavier planks, angled slightly toward the entrance, so that any moisture would run forward and not collect over the sleeping area. Over the planks, she laid a layer of dried hay, then a layer of clay she had mixed with straw in a barrel by the creek until it had the consistency her father had described. Heavy, plastic, slow to crack. Ingrid helped where she could. She was small for 7, but precise in the way of children who have grown up watching adults work carefully. She carried stones from the creek for the floor edging. She held the lantern during the hours after dark. Once, when Margaret was working on the ventilation pipe and could not hold it and attach it simultaneously, Ingrid climbed up the outside of the hillside in the snow and held the upper end in place until her mother called up that it was secured. Margaret did not say much while she worked. She counted things in her head: board feet of lumber, inches of wall depth, the angle of the ventilation pipe, the gap at the base of the door. A woman named Anna Paulson came by on the 3rd week. She was older than Margaret, Scandinavian like her, and she had outlasted 2 husbands and 1 catastrophic spring flood on her own property half a mile up the valley. She stood at the entrance of the half-finished room for a long time without speaking. She ran her hand along the clay wall. She looked at the ventilation pipe. She looked at the angle of the door frame. Then she said, in Norwegian, that it was going to be damp. Margaret said she knew. She said she was not finished yet. Anna Paulson nodded and walked back up the slope and did not come back for 2 weeks. But she came back. The first night Margaret and Ingrid slept inside the finished room, the temperature dropped to 11 degrees Fahrenheit outside. Inside, using only their body heat and a single candle, the room reached 44 degrees by midnight. Margaret lay on her back in the dark and ran through the calculation her father had taught her. She was close. Not close enough. By 3 in the morning, moisture had begun to collect on the lower wall sections. Not ice. Not yet, but the kind of cold damp that she recognized from her father's description as the first sign of an imbalance. The air inside was warming slightly from their bodies, rising, hitting the ceiling, cooling, and dropping back down with the moisture it collected from their breath and from the clay still curing the walls. The floor was pulling cold from below. The ventilation pipe was moving air, but not in the right direction for that time of night, when the outside temperature dropped fastest. She sat up at 4 in the morning and lit a second candle. She did not panic. She had expected something to be wrong. Her father had told her that the first version of anything built into the earth would tell you 3 things you had not anticipated. The useful part was learning to listen. She touched the walls at different heights and noted where the moisture was heaviest. She felt the floor with her bare hand and found the 2 sections that were pulling cold up to the stone edging. She held a candle near the ventilation pipe and watched the flame. The flame leaned the wrong way. She knew what that meant. The pipe was drawing cold air in rather than pushing damp air out. The angle was off by enough to reverse the flow at the temperatures she was dealing with. Her father had warned her about this. She had thought she had solved it. She had not solved it. She spent the next 2 days fixing it. She adjusted the pipe angle, added a small clay hood at the upper outlet to create a pressure differential, and filled the floor gaps with dry creek gravel before laying the stone edging with a layer of packed clay beneath. She replaced the 2 sections of wall base where the clay had not bonded cleanly with the timber. On the 3rd night, she and Ingrid slept inside again. The temperature outside fell to 4 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, without any fire at all, the room reached 47 degrees by midnight and held it until morning. Ingrid slept through the night without coughing once. Margaret lay awake and listened to her breathe. The first real test came in early December. 3 days of snow, then wind, then snow again. The kind of storm that the valley talked about afterward, using the word serious in a way that meant something more than that. 2 families on the eastern edge of the valley lost cattle. A section of the Halverson fence came down under the weight of accumulated snow and drifted over entirely before anyone could repair it. The road into town was closed for 4 days. Margaret and Ingrid moved into the underground room on the first evening of the storm. They brought food for 5 days, the good wool blankets, Ingrid's book, and a small oil lamp Margaret had been saving for emergencies. The entrance they sealed from inside with a fitted timber panel she had built specifically for this purpose, leaving only the ventilation pipe unobstructed. On the second morning, Ingrid reported that the room felt warmer than the night before. Margaret checked the floor. She checked the walls. She checked the pipe. Everything was holding. On the third morning, Margaret heard the cabin, a sound like a held breath releasing, then a crack, then a sustained groan from the direction of the main structure above the slope. She and Ingrid stayed still. Then silence. When the storm passed and she opened the entrance panel, pushing through 8 inches of snow that had drifted against it, she saw that the main cabin was intact in its walls, but that the roof had partially collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow at the north corner, exactly where she had been meaning to reinforce the raft of support for 2 winters. The cabin was not livable, not until she could get the roof repaired, which would require dry weather and materials, and probably help she would have to find a way to ask for. The underground room, the one that looked like a grave, the one that Gus Halverson had warned her about, was the only structure on her property that the storm had not touched. She and Ingrid stood outside in the cold morning air looking at the collapsed corner of the cabin, and then they went back down into the room because it was warmer there, and Margaret made coffee on the small iron trivet she had brought from the kitchen, and Ingrid finished her chapter, and neither of them said anything about Harlan Bryce or the offer for the land. February came the way it sometimes does in that part of the country, with quiet that felt like a warning. The temperature dropped to -8 degrees Fahrenheit on the third night of the month, and did not rise above 10 degrees Fahrenheit for 6 days. Cattle died on 4 properties in the valley. A man on the Birch Creek Road suffered frostbite on 3 fingers walking between his barn and his house. The schoolhouse in town closed for a week. Margaret had been living in the underground room since December. She had made arrangements for Ingrid to continue her lessons with Anna Paulson, who brought work up the slope twice a week and stayed for tea and usually for a longer conversation than either of them admitted they needed. The cabin roof repair was waiting for a break in the weather. On the 4th night of the cold stretch, someone knocked on the door. It was not Harlan Bryce. It was Greta Sorensen, whose husband ran a small operation 2 properties north, and who had wrapped herself in 2 coats and walked through the dark with a lantern because her youngest child, a boy of 4, had developed a rattling cough that frightened her, and because the fire in their cabin was not keeping ahead of the cold, and because she had heard from Anna Paulson that there was a room on the Voss property that stayed warm without burning through a cord of wood a week. Margaret opened the door. Greta stood in the cold with the boy wrapped against her chest and her eyes asking the question before her mouth did. Margaret looked at the child. She looked at the room behind her, calculating the way she always calculated, running the numbers without making it obvious. 2 adults, 1 child, the existing heat from her and Ingrid, the capacity of the space, the ventilation balance she had worked so hard to achieve. The calculation was close. It would be close. But the pipe could handle it, and the walls were cured now and the floor held. She stepped aside. Greta brought the boy in. He stopped shivering within 20 minutes. He slept for 11 hours. In the morning, Greta said she did not have the words. Margaret said she did not need them. On the 6th night of the cold stretch, with Greta and the boys still in the room, and Anna Paulson sleeping in the corner on a borrowed bedroll, and the ventilation pipe running exactly as it should, and the temperature outside falling to -14 degrees Fahrenheit, the room held 51 degrees. The candle on the table burned without flickering. Spring came late that year. The snowmelt ran hard through March and into April, and 3 low-lying properties flooded in a way they had not flooded in recent memory. The road to town became passable again in stages. first by horse, then by wagon, then by everything else. Margaret repaired the cabin roof in the first dry week of April with help from Gus Halverson, who arrived with timber and tools and the manner of a man who had decided not to discuss October. She thanked him for the lumber. He said it was nothing. He looked at the hillside before he left, and did not say anything about that either. Ingrid turned 8 in April. She had not had a significant cough since December. The doctor in town examined her in May and said whatever he had been concerned about seemed to have improved. He attributed it to the mild end of winter. Margaret did not correct him. Harlan Bryce did not come back with another offer. This was not because he had given up on the idea of the land. Margaret knew him well enough to understand that he had simply recalculated. A woman who could engineer her way through the worst February in 11 years on 2.5 cord of wood and a room dug into a hillside was not a woman who would go to accept a low price out of desperation. He would wait for a different kind of pressure. She intended not to give him one. Anna Paulson built her own version of the room in late summer, on the north slope of her property, where a natural bank provided the same kind of protection Margaret had used. She asked Margaret questions over 3 visits, and then did the work herself, with the efficiency of a woman who had been solving practical problems alone for a very long time. Her version was smaller, better finished in some ways, rougher in others. It worked. By the following winter, 2 other families in the valley had dug similar structures, one of them adapting the design for a cold food pantry rather than a sleeping room. The valley did not call them anything in particular. They did not acquire a name. They were just a room under the hill, or the warm hole, or simply the place on the Voss property where the smoke came out of the ground. Margaret never sought credit for it. She was not the type. The idea had come from her father, and from his father before him, and from the people who had lived through northern winters long, before any of them had names recorded anywhere. What she had done was remember it when she needed it. And then she had done the harder thing, which was to build it correctly, alone, in November, with the wrong tools and not enough time and a daughter who needed her to get it right. The room under the hillside outlasted the cabin. It was meant to supplement. It outlasted Harlan Bryce's interest in the property. It outlasted Margaret's time on the land by several decades. And by the time the last person who remembered it was old enough to forget it, the entrance had long since grown over with grass and the ventilation pipe had rusted to nothing. But the shape of it was still there, the hollow in the hillside, the curve of the earth where someone had once decided that the cold was not an enemy to be fought, but a pressure to be redirected. She had not beaten the winter by being warmer than it. She had built something the winter did not know how to find. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.